Our last speaker, Martina Weisz, is research coordinator at the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Antisemitism. She studied political science and international relations at the Universidad Nacional de Rosario in Argentina, holds an MA in international relations from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and completed her PhD there as well. She had published articles on subjects related to human rights, foreign policy, and ethnic minorities in contemporary Spain. Among them, microphysics of otherness, Jews, Muslims, and Latin Americans in contemporary Spain, published in Antisemitism International, and Splitting the Soul, Spanish conservatives, anti-secularism, and the enemizing of Islam. Please, Martina.
Thank you. In Burdens of Brotherhood, Ethan Katz tackles a fascinating topic: the dynamics of encounter and boundary setting between Jews and Muslims in the political context of the, and I quote, French imperial nation state, a concept by Gary Wilder, which Ethan quotes in his book. The challenges involved in this task are manifold, particularly because, as Ethan signals at the very outset of his work, and I quote, Jewish and Muslims have been highly amorphous, contingent, even shifting categories in modern France, constructed both from outside and within. Moreover, their interactions were always what I call triangular, and he said that at the beginning, with France as the third party. My reading of the book was highly influenced by my own research on the role played by Muslims and Jews in the construction of contemporary Spanish identity, a subject on which I've been working for the past 10 years. This standpoint is, in my eyes, particularly interesting because despite the defeat of Islam, the expulsion of the Jews, and the Christian purification, in inverted commas of course, that followed on Spanish territory since the end of the 15th century, by the 19th century, Spain was widely associated in the rest of Western Europe and in Spain itself with the exotic or oriental world of Al-Andalus. Al-Andalus was a cultural political entity under Muslim Arab rule that had covered major parts of the Iberian Peninsula for almost 800 years. It is often idealized as the privileged locus of Muslim, Jewish, and Christian convivencia, coexistence, despite the fact that the relationships between these three ethno-religious groups weren't always peaceful. Not surprisingly, the few words in Spanish or references to Andalusia that appear in Nathan's book refer to cultural places or musical types in North Africa or France where Jews and Muslims interacted harmoniously. This is, for instance, the case of the Alcázar Performance Hall at Marseille's Cour de Belzance, or the Jewish-Muslim orchestra El Gusto in Algeria. Unlike France, during the 20th century, Spain could hardly be considered a successful imperial nation-state. The always problematic and relatively short-lived Spanish protectorate in Morocco that lasted between 1912 and 1956 brought little benefit to a metropole which had not succeeded in overcoming the loss of its colonies in Asia, in the Philippines and America, Cuba and Puerto Rico, during the Spanish-American War, called El Desastre, the disaster of 1898. Yet the memory of its centuries-long imperial splendor remained intact, constituting a core element of its national identity until this very day. Evidence of this centrality is the Spanish Parliament's passing of a law in 1987 establishing October the 12th, the date commemorating Christopher Columbus' discovery, in inverted commas, of the Americas as the Spanish National Day, el Día de la Fiesta Nacional. Moreover, in Spain, the golden age of empire didn't rest upon the enlightened republican commandment calling for a mission civilisatrice, civilizing mission, but on the sacred duty of spreading the Christian Catholic faith around the globe. Interestingly enough, despite these and other significant differences between Spain and France, there are important similarities in the approaches adopted by these two imperial powers towards both Jews and Muslims in the articulation of their imperial designs. First of all, both Madrid and Paris have often, but not always, of course, as in the Vichy period, that's a very good example of that, considered the Jews as full partners in the civilizational burden of imperial expansion. In the French case, both the Crémieux decree of 1870, granting Algerian Jews French citizenship almost 90 years before their fellow Muslims as Ethan signals, and the inclusion of the Jews following the decolonization of Algeria in 1962 into the category repatriates of European origin as opposed to repatriates of Muslim origin, with far-reaching political, cultural, and economic implications, evidences this fact. Significantly, as Ethan underlined in the case of the press reports on the Constantine riots of August 1934, and I quote, such terminology, and he was referring to Algerian Muslims as the fact that the French refer to Algerian Muslims as indigènes and to Algerian Jews as Israelites, such terminology, while hardly new, implied through its constant reiteration that whereas Jews could move beyond their ethnicity and become French, Muslims remained bound to their Maghrebian past, on the end of the quote. In Spain, despite the persistence of anti-Jewish prejudices, or maybe thanks to them, since the end of the 19th century, the Jews have been considered by different personalities from across the political spectrum as useful instruments for the revitalization of an agonizing Spanish empire. The approach of liberal intellectuals, according to which the expulsion and persecution of the Jews had contributed to national decline, was often translated into practical terms. If this was indeed the case, then reestablishing ties with these newly branded Jews with a Spanish homeland could help in the strengthening of the country's international influence. This was the rationale underlying the historical decision made in 1881 by the King Alphonse XII and his government to offer asylum to Jews persecuted in Russia and the Balkans. 30 years later, on December 20th, 1924 to be precise, similar considerations led his successor, Alfonso XIII, during the rule of dictator Miguel Primo de Rivera, to sign a royal decree enabling some Jews of Sephardi origin to become Spanish citizens. Far from being relegated to a distant past, these royal decisions became precedent for two important legal prerogatives granted to the descendants of the Jews who were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula in 1492. The first is the inclusion of a subsection in the Ley de Extranjería, the Alliance Act of 1985, which lowered to 2 years the minimum requirement for residence in the country for Sepharadis requesting citizenship. The second is a law enacted by the Spanish government on June 24, 2015, that's 2 years ago, granting Spanish citizenship to all those who could prove their condition of descendants from the Jews once expelled by the Catholic kings. In contemporary Spain, Sepharadis are no longer seen, like they were a century ago, as potential promoters of trade expansion in the Balkans or strategic collaborators for colonial penetration into North Africa. However, both in the daily press and in government circles, they are often perceived as having great influence in the government of the United States, in the world of finance, and in the mass media. In fact, the then Minister of Justice and Foreign Affairs, Alberto Ruiz Gallardón, who was one of the major promoters of the Citizenship Act, traveled especially to the United States in March 2014 to present the project to the local Jewish community. It is noteworthy that the popular newspaper El País headlined the news of the trip, and I quote, "Government sells in the US its gesture towards Sepharadis." These important Spanish concessions to the descendants of the expelled Jews were systematically denied to the descendants of the Moriscos, Christians of Muslim origin, which were also expelled from the Christian kingdoms established in today's Spain's territory at the beginning of the 17th century. It was between 1609 to 1614. The Spanish government's explicit rejection, despite the many and well-supported requests to grant the Moriscos progenies the same prerogatives in matters of citizenship already given to the Jewish offspring, have some similarity with France's attitude towards Algerian Muslims following decolonization. Maybe we can go even farther. I hope I'm not going too farther. we can discuss that. Here's a hypothesis, okay? Despite the obvious anachronism and the fact that the Moriscos inhabited the Iberian Peninsula and not colonial territories, despite the fact that it was considered as part of France, there is actually some correspondence between the tragic events that took place in the Spanish kingdoms 4 centuries ago and the more recent approach of modern France towards its former colonial population of Islamic faith. As observed by Christian Steller, the expulsion of the Moriscos, decided against the will of the Vatican, was, and I quote, "unique in the history of Christianity, since it was the expulsion of a Christian community from Christian territory." Again, the Moriscos were Christians of Muslim ascent. This drastic political measure was founded upon the Moriscos' alleged resistance to assimilation into the predominantly all-Christian society. But in fact, it expressed the Spanish crown's failure to assimilate the converted offsprings of its former enemy into a Catholic political entity. Like in the case of the blood purity statutes that discriminated against Jews and Muslims alike between the mid-15th and the 19th century, the expulsion evidenced the political limitations of baptism as a rite of purification and admission into the Catholic Church, and the solidification of a, and I quote, biological Catholicism, a term coined by Christian Steller, that was officially sanctioned in Spain for the last time during the Franco dictatorship. The Franco dictatorship lasted between 1939 and 1975. 3.5 centuries after these events, the French Republic would witness a similar failure of its assimilationist principles in Algeria, particularly towards its Muslim population. Indeed, in France by 1962, and I quote from Ethan's book, "The state thus chose to forget that Algeria and its natives had ever been French, or more precisely, that France's Republican mission had failed to make them fully French." This decision had far-reaching implications. De Gaulle's government was breaking with not only its own recent promises, but also Republican law, the assimilatory traditions of French Republican nationalism, and the aggressive integrationist policies of the previous 7 years. End of the quote. Both the Spanish and the French empires claimed allegiance to spiritual concepts or ideas whose appeal remain intact today. Whether in its religious Catholic version in Spain or in its liberal Republican one, France, the vision of a fraternal, peaceful world based upon universal shared values. And here it's important to remember that etymologically, the word Catholic derives from the Greek katholikos, which is universal. is an intrinsic part of our human heritage. Yet today, as yesterday, these ideas are in conflict with the uglier realities of racism and power politics with which they interact dialectically.